The late afternoon sun, a molten orange orb sinking behind the Tulsa skyline, cast long shadows across Richard Beaumont's expansive office. From his vantage point on the 42nd floor, the city sprawled beneath him like a meticulously planned diorama. Richard, a man who had carved his own empire from the very clay of this land, felt a familiar surge of satisfaction. He surveyed the scene with the detached air of a collector admiring a prized possession, a faint smile playing on his lips. The upcoming party, a meticulously orchestrated affair designed to solidify his position amongst Tulsa's elite, was just another piece in his ever-growing collection of triumphs. Chad, his young assistant, stood nervously by the mahogany conference table, a pristine white guest list clutched in his hand. He shuffled his weight from one foot to the other, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. Chad felt a prickle of unease, a premonition that the air in the room was about to thicken, turn heavy with one of Richard's capricious whims. He learned to recognize the signs, the almost imperceptible narrowing of Richard's eyes, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way he tapped his Mont-Blanc pen against the polished wood with a rhythm that seemed to echo the ticking of a bomb. "Everything in order, Chad?" Richard's voice, smooth as aged whiskey, cut through the silence. "Yes, sir. All confirmed attendees are marked. Catering, entertainment, security, everything is finalized as per your instructions." Chad held his breath, waiting. He knew this performance of meticulousness was often a prelude to Richard's impulsive diversions. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, the city lights twinkling like fallen stars in the reflection of his expensive watch. "A predictable assembly, wouldn't you say, Chad?" he mused, a hint of boredom creeping into his voice. "The same tired faces, the same rehearsed pleasantries. Needs a bit of spice." Chad swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He had a feeling he knew where this was going. Richard had a penchant for disruption, for injecting chaos into meticulously planned scenarios, just to see how the pieces would fall. Perhaps a surprise guest? Richard's eyes glinted with a predatory gleam. "Let's throw someone ridiculous on the list. Just for kicks." Chad's stomach churned. He hated these moments, these glimpses into the casual cruelty that simmered beneath Richard's polished veneer. He could already envision the ripple of discomfort, the forced laughter, the whispers that would follow. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer a feeble protest, but the words caught in his throat. He knew better than to challenge Richard when he was in this mood. Richard's gaze drifted towards the window, his eyes scanning the streets below. A slow smile spread across his face. That cleaning lady from downstairs. Marsha Bell. Imagine the look on their faces when she walks in. The name echoed in Chad's ears, a discordant note in the symphony of Richard's carefully curated world. Marsha Bell, a quiet, dignified woman, a widow raising 2 sons, scrubbing floors, and emptying trash cans to make ends meet. He'd seen her in the hallways, her head held high, a quiet strength radiating from her despite the menial nature of her work. He felt a pang of guilt, a sharp stab of shame at the thought of her being used as a pawn in Richard's twisted game. Marsha Bell. Chad's voice was barely a whisper, a futile attempt to steer Richard away from the precipice of his own cruelty. "Yes," Richard said, his voice laced with a cruel amusement. "The irony is simply exquisite. Imagine her amongst the Vanderbilts and the Carmichaels. The epitome of incongruity." He chuckled, a sound devoid of any real mirth. Chad felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He knew arguing was pointless. Richard had already made up his mind. The image of Marsha, her kind face etched with confusion and hurt, flashed through his mind. He wished he could warn her, shield her from the humiliation that awaited her. But he knew he wouldn't. He was too afraid of losing his own precarious perch in Richard's world. "Get her address, Chad," Richard instructed, his voice brisk and businesslike, the amusement fading as he moved on to the next item on his agenda. "Send her a formal invitation. The best stationery, of course. We wouldn't want to appear uncouth." Chad nodded, his throat tight with unspoken protest. He reached for his phone, the cold metal a stark contrast to the burning shame that coiled in his gut. As he typed Marsha Bell's name into the search bar, he felt a sense of complicity settle over him, heavy and suffocating. He was part of this now, a cog in the machinery of Richard's casual cruelty. He could have spoken up, could have refused, but he hadn't. And in that moment of silence, he knew he had become as much a part of the joke as Richard himself. The city lights outside, once a symbol of aspiration and achievement, now seemed to mock him, tiny pinpricks of guilt against the vast, indifferent darkness. The flimsy paper felt alien in her calloused hands, the embossed lettering mocking her with its gilded elegance. An invitation to Richard Beaumont's annual summer gala. Marsha Bell, a woman whose hands knew more about bleach and grime than champagne flutes and silk, stared at the heavy stock, the absurdity of it twisting a knot in her stomach. The Beaumont estate, a place she'd only glimpsed from the bus window, a fortress of privilege rising like an ivory tower against the Tulsa sky. She could almost smell the money, a cloying scent of expensive perfumes and imported cigars mingling with the faint chlorine whisper of a meticulously maintained pool. An invitation to a joke I ain't sure I'm supposed to laugh at. The words slipped out, a bitter taste coating her tongue. She tossed the invitation onto the worn kitchen table, the laminate scarred with memories of spilled juice boxes and hurried dinners. Outside, the Friday night air hung heavy with humidity, the distant drone of traffic a lullaby of the city that had both nurtured and neglected her. The invitation, nestled amongst unpaid bills and supermarket flyers, seemed to pulse with a malicious energy. Richard Beaumont. The name itself tasted like ash in her mouth. He was a man who built empires on land others had toiled on for generations, a man whose casual disregard for those beneath him was as legendary as his real estate portfolio. Had he actually sent this? Or was it some cruel prank orchestrated by one of his sycophantic associates? Marsha's hand, roughened by years of scrubbing and scouring, reached out, tracing the elaborate script of her name. A tremor, barely perceptible, ran through her fingers. Humiliation simmered beneath her skin, a slow burn that threatened to erupt into a blaze of anger. She imagined the whispers, the veiled amusement in the eyes of Tulsa's elite, their laughter bouncing off the crystal chandeliers of the Beaumont estate. The thought tightened her throat, a suffocating pressure that made it hard to breathe. The insistent ringing of her phone sliced through the silence. Dorian, her youngest, his voice, a soothing balm against the raw edges of her hurt, filled the small kitchen. "Mama? Everything all right? You sound off." She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. How could she explain this insidious feeling of being reduced to a punchline, a pawn in a game she didn't understand? "Got an invitation in the mail." She finally managed, her voice strained. "From Mr. Beaumont." There was a pause, a pregnant silence that spoke volumes. Dorian knew. He knew the undercurrents of Tulsa, the unspoken rules that governed the interactions between the haves and the have-nots. He knew what an invitation like this meant. "Mama," he said softly, his voice laced with a protective anger she recognized. "That ain't right. That Mana's playing games." A wave of exhaustion washed over Marsha. She wanted to crawl into bed, pull the covers over her head, and pretend the world outside didn't exist. But Dorian's words, laced with both concern and defiance, sparked a flicker of something else within her. Not anger, not resentment, but a quiet, unwavering resolve. "He is," she agreed, her voice gaining strength. "But I ain't gonna let him win." "What are you gonna do?" Dorian's question hung in the air, thick with anticipation. Marsha looked at the invitation again, the gilded letters now seeming less like a mockery and more like a challenge. An idea, audacious and defiant, began to take root in her mind. A slow smile spread across her face, transforming her features, illuminating the quiet strength that resided within. "I'm gonna go," she said, her voice ringing with newfound conviction. "To that party?" Disbelief tinged Dorian's voice. "Yes, sir," Marsha replied, the word laced with a steel she hadn't realized she possessed. "I'm gonna go. Emma, put on my best dress, the one I wore for your daddy's funeral." Emma hold my head high, and Emma walk into that fancy house like I own the damn place. A long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the hum of the refrigerator. Then Dorian's voice, filled with a mixture of awe and admiration, broke through. "Then go," he said. "Let them see you." The call ended, but Dorian's words echoed in the quiet of the kitchen, a powerful mantra that fueled Marsha's resolve. She retrieved the invitation from the table, her fingers no longer trembling, but firm and purposeful. She wouldn't be a punchline. She wouldn't be invisible. She would show Richard Beaumont and everyone else at that party that Marsha Bell was a force to be reckoned with. The small hours of the morning found Marsha meticulously preparing. The worn linoleum of her bathroom floor felt cold beneath her bare feet as she carefully applied her makeup, each stroke a defiant act of self-care. The scent of her late husband's cologne, a faint whisper of sandalwood and spice, clung to the air, a comforting presence in the otherwise empty house. She pulled out her best dress, a deep indigo gown that hugged her curves with a quiet elegance. It had been years since she'd worn it, years since she'd felt the need to present herself to the world with such deliberate grace. But tonight, she would reclaim that grace. She would wear it like armor. Tonight, she would be seen. The taxi ride to the Beaumont estate felt like a journey into another world. The streets transformed from cracked asphalt and boarded-up storefronts to smooth, tree-lined avenues, the houses growing larger and more opulent with each passing block. Marsha watched the city morph through the taxi window, her reflection superimposed on the passing landscape, a ghost of herself staring back from a world she barely recognized. The knot in her stomach tightened, a mix of apprehension and a strange, exhilarating anticipation. As the taxi pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the Beaumont estate, a wave of dizziness washed over Marsha. The sheer scale of the place was overwhelming, the manicured lawns stretching out like a vast green carpet, the mansion itself a monument to wealth and excess. She paid the driver, her hand trembling slightly as she handed over the crumpled bills, a significant portion of her week's earnings. This act, this small sacrifice, felt like an investment, a down payment on her own self-worth. Taking a deep breath, Marsha straightened her shoulders and walked towards the gates, her indigo gown a splash of vibrant color against the muted backdrop of privilege. She didn't know what awaited her inside, but she knew one thing for sure. She would not be broken. She would not be silenced. She would walk into that party, and she would let them all see her. The real Marsha Bell. A woman of quiet strength, unwavering dignity, and a spirit that refused to be dimmed. The broken air conditioner wheezed a mournful tune, a counterpoint to the rhythmic whir of ceiling fans pushing around the humid Oklahoma air. Marsha Bell stood on the cracked pavement outside the bus stop, the midday sun turning the asphalt into a shimmering mirage. Her reflection wavered in the glass storefront of Elegance Boutique, a name that seemed to mock the worn cotton dress clinging to her damp skin. Dorian's words echoed in her ears, a persistent hum beneath the city's noise. "Go, Mama. Show him." Show him what exactly? She wasn't sure. All she knew was a cold knot of defiance tightening in her stomach, a refusal to be dismissed, to be the butt of a rich man's cruel joke. Richard Beaumont's invitation, a gilded cage lined with barbed wire, still burned in her purse. He wanted a spectacle. Fine. She'd give him one. Elegance Boutique smelled of dust and old perfume, a faint sweetness clinging to the racks of brightly colored dresses. The saleswoman, a thin girl with bored eyes and bubblegum pink lipstick, barely glanced up from her phone as Marsha entered. Marsha hesitated, the chill of the air conditioning raising goosebumps on her arms. She felt a familiar wave of self-consciousness, the feeling of being out of place, a feeling she'd carried with her since childhood. This wasn't her world. Sequins and satin weren't meant for a woman who spent her days scrubbing other people's floors. But then, Richard Beaumont wasn't her world either. And yet, he dared to pull her into it. A flicker of anger, hot and sharp, chased away the hesitation. She ran a calloused hand over the sleeve of a crimson gown, the fabric cool and smooth against her skin. It was beautiful, yes, but not enough. "I'm looking for something dramatic," Marsha said, her voice quieter than she intended. The saleswoman finally looked up, her gaze sweeping over Marsha with a mixture of disinterest and faint amusement. "For a wedding?" she asked, her tone implying that Marsha couldn't possibly be the bride. "A party," Marsha replied, meeting the girl's gaze. Something in her eyes, a quiet steeliness, made the saleswoman's smile falter. "Right this way," she mumbled, gesturing towards the back of the store where the more expensive gowns hung, shimmering like captured moonlight. Marsha trailed after her, the silence punctuated by the click of her heels on the tiled floor. Each click felt like a small act of rebellion, a declaration of her presence in this alien world. She stopped before a gown of deep emerald green satin. It flowed from a sculpted bodice to a floor-length skirt, the fabric catching the light and shimmering like a jewel. It was bold, extravagant, a statement. Marsha reached out, her fingers tracing the smooth, cool fabric. It felt like a second skin, a shield against the world's judging eyes. This was it. "I'll try this one," she said, her voice gaining a newfound confidence. In the cramped fitting room, the emerald green gown transformed her. The color deepened the rich tones of her skin, the satin clinging to her curves in all the right places. As she looked at her reflection, a slow smile spread across her face. She hadn't seen this woman in years, this woman who wasn't just a cleaning lady, a mother, a widow. This woman was powerful, beautiful, untouchable. The image of Richard Beaumont's condescending smirk flashed in her mind, fueling a quiet fire in her belly. He wanted a show? He'd get one. He wanted to see her humiliated? He would see something else entirely. "I need to look like I belong somewhere they don't want me," she murmured to her reflection, the words a whispered incantation. The saleswoman, holding a pair of silver heels, stared at Marsha with wide eyes. The bored indifference had vanished, replaced by something akin to awe. "You look incredible," she breathed, a genuine smile finally gracing her lips. Marsha met her gaze in the mirror, a sense of satisfaction settling deep within her. This wasn't about vanity. It was about reclaiming something that had been stolen from her, something intangible yet essential, her dignity. Richard Beaumont had attempted to reduce her to a caricature, a source of amusement for his wealthy friends. But he had underestimated her. He had underestimated the quiet strength that resided within her, the strength forged in hardship, in loss, in years of silent struggle. He had mistaken her humility for weakness. He had misjudged her silence for acquiescence. She stepped out of the fitting room, the emerald green gown shimmering around her like a protective aura. The saleswoman rushed forward, adjusting the straps, smoothing the fabric, her earlier disinterest replaced by a flurry of nervous energy. Marsha felt a strange sense of calm descend upon her, a stillness in the eye of the storm. She was ready. The price tag stung, a significant portion of her savings disappearing in a single transaction. But as she walked out of Elegance Boutique, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, she didn't regret it. The weight of the shopping bag in her hand wasn't just the weight of a dress. It was the weight of her resolve. It was the weight of a silent promise she made to herself, a promise to stand tall, to meet Richard Beaumont's gaze without flinching, to show him, and the world, that Marsha Bell was more than just a cleaning lady. She was a woman of substance, of resilience, of quiet, unwavering power. And tonight, she would shine. The wrought iron gates, tipped with menacing spikes, seemed to sneer at the modest sedan as it crawled up the long, winding driveway. Inside, Marsha Bell gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles bone white against her dark skin. Doubt gnawed at the edges of her resolve. What madness had possessed her to come here? Dorian's words echoed in her mind. "Mama, you deserve respect. Don't let him get away with this." But respect wasn't served on silver platters at parties like these. Respect was earned through years of quiet dignity, of raising children right, of keeping your head high even when the world tried to push it down. She swallowed hard, the lump in her throat a testament to the battle raging within. The car pulled to a stop before the imposing mansion. It sprawled across the manicured lawn like a marble beast, every window gleaming with the promise of opulence. Music spilled out, a jazzy melody laced with the tinkling of laughter, a sound so foreign to her ears. Marsha took a deep breath, the scent of freshly cut grass and something vaguely floral assaulting her senses. It was a perfume, she realized, expensive and unfamiliar, a stark contrast to the faint scent of bleach that clung to her own clothes. For a moment, the sheer absurdity of it all threatened to overwhelm her. A cleaning lady at a millionaire's party. It was a cruel joke, and she was the punchline. But then, Dorian's face, young and earnest, flashed in her mind. She straightened her simple black dress, a garment chosen for comfort and practicality, not for dazzling under chandeliers. Tonight, she would not be the joke. Tonight, she would be the one who laughed last. A young, nervous-looking man in a tuxedo hurried down the steps. Chad. He'd been the one to deliver the invitation, his eyes darting around as if expecting someone to jump out and expose the prank. Now, seeing her actually emerge from the car, his face paled. "Mrs. Bell," he stammered, extending a hand that seemed to tremble slightly. "Mr. Beaumont is expecting you." Marsha met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Expecting me? Or expecting a good laugh? The thought tasted bitter in her mouth, but her voice was smooth as silk. "Lead the way." The inside of the mansion was even more extravagant than she'd imagined. Crystal chandeliers dripped with light, illuminating a swirling mass of silk gowns and tailored suits. The air hummed with conversations she couldn't quite decipher, punctuated by bursts of forced laughter. Marsha felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, the sheer opulence of the place disorienting. She'd seen places like this in magazines, glossy spreads showcasing a world she'd never imagined inhabiting, not even in her wildest dreams. Now, here she was, a stark silhouette against a backdrop of extravagance. As Chad led her through the throng, whispers followed her like shadows. She could feel the curious stares burning into her back, the veiled amusement in some, the outright bewilderment in others. Who is this woman? Their eyes seemed to ask, what's she doing here? Marsha held her head high, her gaze fixed on the figure at the far end of the room. Richard Beaumont. He stood amidst a cluster of admirers, a glass of champagne held loosely in his hand. He was exactly as she'd pictured him, tall, impeccably dressed, with an air of detached amusement that seemed to radiate outwards, pushing everyone else to the periphery. Chad cleared his throat, drawing Beaumont's attention. The smile on the man's face faltered, then slowly dissolved as his eyes landed on Marsha. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking oddly vulnerable. The transformation was subtle, yet palpable, a ripple of unease spreading through the room like a virus. For a fleeting moment, Marsha felt a pang of something. Not pity, not exactly. Perhaps it was the satisfaction of seeing the mask slip, of witnessing the arrogance momentarily crumble. "Mrs. Bell," Beaumont said, his voice strained. He moved towards her, his steps slightly hesitant. What a surprise. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Marsha met his gaze, her own expression a carefully crafted blend of politeness and disdain. "That's funny," she said, her voice soft yet firm. "I was just thinking the same thing about you." The words hung in the air, sharp as shards of glass. The silence stretched, thick with tension. The tinkling laughter had ceased, replaced by a hushed expectancy. The guests, like moths drawn to a flickering flame, began to gravitate closer, their curiosity piqued. Beaumont's jaw tightened. He recovered quickly, though, the mask of amusement sliding back into place, albeit with a visible crack. "I see you received my invitation," he said, his tone tinged with a hint of sarcasm. "Yes," Marsha replied, her eyes unwavering. "And I must say, Mr. Beaumont, it takes a whole lot more than paper and wax to offend me." Her words, though quiet, resonated through the room, slicing through the superficial chatter like a knife. Beaumont flinched, the amusement finally fading from his eyes, replaced by something akin to bewilderment. He had expected anger, perhaps even tears. He had certainly not expected this quiet strength, this unwavering dignity. A woman's voice, clear and melodic, cut through the tension. "Marsha Bell? Is that really you?" A woman with warm brown skin and a dazzling smile pushed through the crowd. "It's Loretta. Loretta Franklin. We used to sing together at First Baptist." Loretta's eyes sparkled with recognition. "My goodness, it's been years. You still have that voice? The one that could make the angels weep." The unexpected recognition, the genuine warmth in Loretta's voice, acted as a balm to the simmering tension. It was a lifeline, a reminder that she was more than just a cleaning lady, a target of a cruel joke. She was Marsha Bell, a woman with a history, a voice, a life that extended beyond the confines of this opulent prison. And for the first time since arriving, Marsha felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps tonight wouldn't be a complete disaster after all. The grand piano in the corner, a gleaming black behemoth, continued its melancholic waltz. Marsha watched the pianist's fingers dance across the ivory keys, each note a tiny pinprick against the backdrop of hushed conversations. Around her, the air shimmered with an almost palpable tension. She felt at the moment she stepped inside this opulent prison, a tension woven from whispers and sidelong glances. It clung to the expensive fabrics, the crystal chandeliers, even the perfectly manicured smiles of the guests. She sipped her champagne, the bubbles tickling her throat, a stark contrast to the knot in her stomach. Richard Beaumont hadn't approached her since his initial, condescending greeting. He hovered near the fireplace, a carefully constructed image of relaxed affability, but Marsha could sense his unease. His eyes, though seemingly fixed on some distant point, kept flicking back to her. She recognized that look. It wasn't admiration. It was a mixture of bewilderment and irritation, like a stain he couldn't quite scrub out. "He thinks I'll crumble," she thought, a flicker of steel hardening her gaze. "He thinks I'll slink away, ashamed. But he doesn't know me." The entrance of a new guest caused a ripple in the room. A woman, tall and elegant in a flowing emerald gown, swept in, her laughter preceding her like a fanfare. Marsha watched as she moved through the crowd, greeting people with an easy familiarity that spoke of belonging. Then their eyes met. The woman stopped mid-sentence, her smile widening into something akin to disbelief. "Oh my God, girl, you look like a whole queen out here." The voice, rich and resonant, sent a jolt of recognition through Marsha. Loretta Franklin. They'd sung together in the gospel choir years ago, before life had taken them down different paths. Loretta, with her soaring soprano and infectious energy, had always been a force of nature. Seeing her here, in this alien world of marble and money, felt both surreal and strangely comforting. Marsha's carefully constructed composure wavered. A warmth spread through her chest, melting the icy knot of anxiety. "Loretta? Is that really you?" Loretta rushed forward, enveloping Marsha in a hug that smelled of expensive perfume and something else, something indefinable, that Marsha recognized as success. "Marsha Bell, I haven't seen you in ages. You haven't changed a bit, still got that regal air about you." Loretta turned to the small group she'd been talking to, her voice ringing with genuine enthusiasm. "Everyone, this is Marsha Bell. The Marsha Bell. You remember that voice, right? From the First Baptist Church choir?" Girl could hit notes that'd make angels weep. The group, initially hesitant, now swarmed around Marsha, curiosity replacing their previous indifference. They peppered her with questions, their eyes alight with newfound interest. Marsha, surprised by the sudden shift in attention, found herself recounting anecdotes from her singing days, the years of joy and camaraderie flooding back. She felt a spark ignite within her, a dormant ember of passion rekindled. Richard Beaumont, from his position by the fireplace, watched the scene unfold with a deepening frown. He'd intended this party to be a showcase of his own success, a carefully orchestrated performance for his peers. But Marsha's presence, her quiet dignity, was disrupting the script. He couldn't understand it. She should have been a footnote, a fleeting moment of amusement. Instead, she was becoming the focal point, drawing his guests into her orbit like some celestial body. How? He wondered, a prickle of unease turning into a full-blown itch beneath his skin. How's she doing this? He caught Chad's eye across the room. His assistant, usually so adept at navigating social situations, looked as bewildered as Richard felt. Chad gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a silent acknowledgement of the unexpected turn of events. Richard felt a surge of irritation. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He took a large gulp of his scotch, the burning liquid doing little to quench the rising tide of discomfort. Marsha, surrounded by a captivated audience, felt a strange sense of liberation. She'd walked into this house expecting humiliation, expecting to be treated like an invisible servant. But something had shifted. Loretta's arrival, her unwavering affirmation of Marsha's worth, had cracked the veneer of superficiality that coated this gathering. These people, initially so quick to judge, were now seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. And it wasn't pity she saw in their eyes. It was something akin to respect. The conversations deepened, moving beyond polite pleasantries and into the realm of genuine connection. Marsha found herself talking about her life, her struggles, her dreams for her sons. She spoke of her late husband, her voice thick with emotion, and saw a flicker of understanding in the eyes of a woman who had also known loss. The grand piano in the corner, once a symbol of opulent indifference, now seemed to be playing a different tune, its melody weaving a tapestry of shared human experience. Richard, increasingly isolated in his own home, felt a cold dread creeping into his heart. He'd spent his life building walls, protecting himself from vulnerability, from the messy realities of human emotion. He'd surrounded himself with people who mirrored his own detachment, who valued appearances above authenticity. But Marsha's presence, her raw honesty, was chipping away at those carefully constructed defenses. He saw it in the faces of his guests, the way they leaned in, listening intently to her every word. He saw it in the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the air now thick with a sincerity that felt both foreign and unsettling. He'd wanted to diminish her, to make her feel small. But it was he who felt small now, dwarfed by her quiet strength, her unwavering dignity. He watched her, a strange mixture of resentment and awe churning within him, and knew, with a sickening certainty, that he had miscalculated. He'd underestimated the power of a woman who refused to be silenced. The opulent hallway, bathed in the soft glow of recessed lighting, seemed to stretch endlessly, a polished labyrinth reflecting the fragmented conversations echoing from the main ballroom. Marsha smoothed down the simple, elegant dress Dorian had insisted she wear, a stark contrast to the shimmering gowns that drifted past. Each rustle of silk, each clink of champagne flutes, grated on her nerves, a constant reminder of the chasm that separated her from the gilded world of Richard Beaumont. Her initial shock had given way to a simmering anger, a slow burn fueled by the realization that she had been the butt of a cruel joke. She hadn't anticipated the depth of the humiliation, the way it had momentarily stripped her of her hard-earned dignity. But as the minutes ticked by, the shame began to morph into something harder, something sharper. Resolve settled in her bones, as solid and unshakable as the foundation of her faith. She wouldn't let him get away with this. Footsteps approached, echoing on the marble floor. She knew who it was before she turned. Richard Beaumont, his face a mask of strained apology, halted a few feet away. The jovial mask he wore for his guests had slipped, revealing a flicker of unease in his eyes. He opened his mouth, then hesitated, as if searching for the right words, the magic combination that would erase the evening's transgression. "Mrs. Bell," he began, his voice low and carefully modulated. I wanted to apologize. This whole thing, it was meant to be a harmless jest." He gave a small, self-deprecating laugh, but it lacked any genuine mirth. Harmless? Marsha thought, the word echoing in her mind like a discordant note. Harmless to whom? She met his gaze, her own steady and unflinching. The faint scent of his expensive cologne, something woody and spiced, mingled with the perfume of the other guests, creating a cloying sweetness that suddenly felt suffocating. She wanted fresh air, the familiar smell of earth and rain. She wanted to be anywhere but here, trapped in this gilded cage with a man who viewed her as nothing more than a pawn in his twisted game. "A jest, Mr. Beaumont?" she asked, her voice quiet but laced with steel. She saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. He was uncomfortable, she realized, not with the situation itself, but with her reaction. He had expected subservience, perhaps even amusement. He hadn't expected her to stand her ground. He shifted his weight, the polished leather of his shoes gleaming under the chandelier's light. It was misguided, he conceded, the word a carefully chosen euphemism. "I assure you, no offense was intended." Marsha's silence stretched, heavy and pregnant with unspoken words. He fidgeted, the forced casualness of his posture beginning to crack. The silence was a weapon, she realized, and she wielded it with precision. She watched him, dissecting his discomfort with a detached curiosity, like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. He cleared his throat. "Look," he said, his voice taking on a sharper edge, "I understand that you might feel out of place here." The words, so casually delivered, struck her with the force of a physical blow. Out of place. He thought she was out of place. A bitter laugh rose in her throat, but she swallowed it down, replacing it with a look of quiet assessment. "You're not uncomfortable because I'm out of place, Mr. Beaumont," she said, her voice low but resonant, each word carefully enunciated. "You're uncomfortable because I belong here." The statement hung in the air, thick and heavy, displacing the superficial pleasantries that had filled the hallway moments before. She saw the realization dawn in his eyes, a slow, dawning horror that mirrored her own initial humiliation. He had underestimated her. He had seen only her uniform, her occupation, her skin color. He hadn't seen her. He hadn't seen the woman who had raised 2 sons on her own, the woman who had faced hardship with unwavering strength, the woman who had found solace and power in her faith. He hadn't seen the woman who, despite his cruel joke, stood before him with her head held high, refusing to be diminished. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked away, his gaze drifting down the hallway, as if searching for an escape. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the muffled music and laughter from the ballroom. The carefully constructed facade of the evening, the illusion of effortless elegance and carefree joy, began to crumble, revealing the raw, uncomfortable truth beneath. And in that silence, in the stark contrast between his discomfort and her unwavering composure, a shift occurred. The power dynamic tilted ever so slightly in her favor. The crystal chandelier, a monstrous cascade of light, cast fractured rainbows across the polished marble floor. Marsha stood beneath it, feeling its cold glare like a judgment. The room, a cavernous space filled with a murmur of hushed voices, seemed to breathe around her, an alien entity observing her intrusion. Her hands, callous from years of scrubbing and polishing other people's possessions, trembled slightly as she clutched the microphone. "Lord, give me strength," she prayed silently, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This wasn't her world. These weren't her people. Yet here she was, a cleaning woman in a sea of silk and diamonds, about to sing for the man who had thought to make a mockery of her. Richard Beaumont stood near the grand fireplace, a statue carved from ice, his eyes cold and distant. He hadn't apologized, not really. A mumbled misunderstanding, a curt nod, those were his offerings at the altar of contrition. Marsha could still taste the bitterness of the humiliation, a sour tang in the back of her throat. But something had shifted within her when Loretta, her voice ringing with conviction, had announced her to the room. A spark of defiance had ignited, a refusal to be dismissed. The pianist, a young man with nervous eyes, nodded, and the first chords of the song filled the air. It was an old gospel hymn, a song her grandmother used to sing, a song woven into the fabric of her being. "I won't complain," she began, her voice trembling at first, then gaining strength. rising above the whispers and clinking glasses. Each note was a breath of her life, a testament to her struggles, her joys, her unwavering faith. She closed her eyes, letting the melody carry her, transporting her back to the small wooden church of her childhood, to the warmth of her grandmother's embrace. The faces in the crowd blurred, their expressions lost to her as she poured her heart into the song. Her voice, rich and resonant, filled the opulent room, weaving a spell of silence over the assembled guests. She sang of hardship and resilience, of faith and forgiveness, of finding strength in the face of adversity. Chad, Richard's assistant, watched from the sidelines, a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He had been a willing participant in the charade, blinded by a misguided loyalty to his boss. Now, listening to Marsha sing, he felt a pang of shame. He saw the raw emotion in her eyes, the dignity in her bearing, and realized the cruelty of their prank. He glanced at Richard, hoping to see a flicker of remorse, a sign of understanding. But Richard's face remained impassive, a mask of indifference. How could he not feel this? Chad wondered, the question a heavy weight in his chest. Loretta, standing near the front, felt a surge of pride. She had known Marsha for years, had witnessed her quiet strength and unwavering spirit. Seeing her now, commanding the attention of this room, full of privileged strangers, filled her with a deep satisfaction. This wasn't just about Marsha. It was about all the women like her, the women whose voices were too often silenced, whose stories were too often ignored. Loretta watched as the expressions on the faces of the guests shifted from curiosity to awe, from amusement to respect. Richard, however, remained unmoved. He stood with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the singer. The music, the emotion in Marsha's voice, seemed to bounce off him, leaving him untouched. He felt a prickle of annoyance. This wasn't how the evening was supposed to go. This wasn't the amusement he had anticipated. He had expected subservience, embarrassment, perhaps even a tearful retreat. Instead, this woman, this cleaning lady, was holding court in his living room, captivating his guests with her singing. It's just a song, he told himself, trying to dismiss the unsettling feeling that crept into his heart. She's just a cleaning lady. But the words felt hollow, even to his own ears. He could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the subtle change in the way his guests were looking at him. Not with admiration, not with the usual deference, but with something else. Pity? Disapproval? The thought sent a wave of unease through him. Marsha finished the song, the last note hanging in the air like a whispered prayer. A moment of stunned silence followed. Then a wave of applause erupted, washing over her like a warm embrace. She opened her eyes, her gaze settling on Richard. His face, still impassive, was now etched with a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Was it regret, confusion, or simply annoyance? She couldn't be sure. But in that moment, looking into his eyes, she felt a sense of triumph. She had taken his cruel joke and turned it into a testament to her own strength and dignity. She had shown him, and everyone in that room, that she was more than just a cleaning lady. She was a woman with a voice, a woman with a story, a woman worthy of respect. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. The last strains of jazz faded, swallowed by the opulent silence of Richard Beaumont's mansion. The guests, their faces a mixture of bewilderment and forced smiles, had finally dispersed. Crystal chandeliers glittered, casting long, cold shadows across the now empty ballroom, reflecting off the untouched platters of canapes. Richard stood by the French windows, the city lights twinkling like a scattered handful of diamonds against the velvet black of the night. He swirled the remnants of amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking faintly, a brittle sound in the echoing space. The scent of expensive perfume, lingering in the air, felt cloying, a sickly sweet reminder of the evening's unsettling events. He hadn't anticipated this. The evening, meticulously planned, orchestrated to impress potential investors, had unraveled into something else entirely. He hadn't even spoken to Mr. Henderson, the key investor he'd been courting for months. The image of Marsha Bell, standing tall and dignified in his ballroom, her voice ringing with quiet power, kept flashing before his eyes. He hadn't expected her to come. He hadn't expected her to sing. He hadn't expected anything other than the cheap amusement he'd so craved, the validation of his own superiority. He hadn't expected her. The quiet strength that emanated from her, the unwavering gaze that held his, the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere when she spoke. It had unnerved him. He'd felt exposed, his carefully constructed facade of affluence and power crumbling under the weight of her presence. He'd felt small. Chad, his young assistant, hovered nervously by the door, his face pale and drawn. "Everything all right, Mr. Beaumont?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Richard turned, his gaze sharp, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Just go home, Chad," he said, the words clipped dismissive. Chad hesitated, his lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. He looked at Richard, his expression a mixture of concern and apprehension. "I just wanted to say about Mrs. Bell," he stammered, his voice trailing off. Richard cut him off with a wave of his hand. "It's fine, Chad. Just forget it." The words felt hollow, even to his own ears. He knew it wasn't fine. Nothing felt fine. He wanted to be alone, to dissect the evening, to understand how it had gone so wrong. How a cleaning lady, a woman he'd dismissed as insignificant, had managed to dismantle the carefully constructed world he'd built around himself. Chad, sensing his dismissal, nodded quickly and slipped out of the room, leaving Richard alone in the vast, silent expanse of his mansion. The silence, once a symbol of his success, now felt oppressive, suffocating. He poured himself another drink, the amber liquid sloshing against the crystal glass, a small, insignificant sound in the vast emptiness. Meanwhile, the hum of the Uber filled the space between Marsha and her quiet satisfaction. The city lights blurred past the window, a kaleidoscope of colors against the darkening sky. She leaned her head back against the headrest, closing her eyes, the melody of the spiritual still echoing in her mind. She could still feel the weight of the gazes, the initial shock, the gradual shift from amusement to respect. She hadn't planned to sing. She hadn't planned to do anything other than show up, to confront the man who had dared to make a mockery of her. But then, Loretta's words, the unexpected recognition, had ignited something within her. A spark of defiance, a surge of pride. She opened her eyes, a small smile playing on her lips. "That's all it took," she murmured, the words barely audible above the hum of the engine. The Uber driver, a young man with a friendly smile, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Excuse me, ma'am?" he asked. Marsha shook her head. "Nothing, son," she replied, her voice soft, laced with a newfound confidence. She looked out the window again, the city lights no longer a blur, but individual points of light, each one a tiny beacon of hope. She had gone to that party expecting humiliation, expecting to be the butt of a cruel joke. Instead, she had reclaimed her dignity, her self-worth. She had shown Richard Beaumont and everyone else in that room that she was more than just a cleaning lady. She was Marsha Bell, a woman of strength, resilience, and unwavering faith. As the Uber pulled up to her modest home, a wave of warmth washed over her. Dorian, her youngest son, was waiting on the porch, his face etched with worry. He rushed towards her as she stepped out of the car. "Mama, are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Marsha smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. "I'm more than okay, baby," she replied, her voice strong and steady. "I got plenty." And in that moment, she knew she did. She had her dignity, her family, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that she had faced adversity head-on and emerged victorious. The memory of the stunned silence in Richard Beaumont's opulent ballroom, the weight of his gaze, the flicker of something akin to regret in his eyes, would be enough. It was more than enough. The silence of his office was a stark contrast to the forced gaiety of Saturday night. Richard Beaumont sat at his massive mahogany desk, the polished surface reflecting the gray light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched out before him, a concrete and glass tapestry woven with the threads of his ambition. Yet the view held no allure this morning. His hand, usually steady as he signed million-dollar deals, trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee, the lukewarm liquid doing little to soothe the gnawing unease in his gut. He hadn't slept well. The echo of gospel music and the unsettling image of Marsha Bell in his home clinging to the edges of his consciousness. He'd expected a hangover, the familiar dull throb behind his temples after an evening of indulgence. But this was different. It was a deeper ache, a hollowness that resonated not in his head, but in his chest. He'd thrown extravagant parties before, each one a carefully orchestrated performance designed to impress, to reinforce his position at the pinnacle of Tulsa's social hierarchy. But this one had left a bitter taste, a residue of something unsettling he couldn't quite name. He glanced at the pristine expanse of his desk, noting with a flicker of irritation the absence of the usual clutter. Where were the files Chad usually left for his perusal? Where's the daily schedule? He pressed the intercom button, his voice sharper than he intended. Chad, get in here. The delay, a mere few seconds, felt like an eternity, amplifying the unsettling quiet. When his assistant finally appeared, his face was pale, his eyes avoiding Richard's gaze. Where are those Henderson files? Richard demanded, his voice echoing in the spacious office. Chad stammered an apology, explaining they were still being compiled. Richard waved him off impatiently, a sudden wave of weariness washing over him. He knew he was being unreasonable, taking his frustration out on the young man, but the disquiet within him demanded an outlet. And Marsha, where is she? He asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. Marsha? Chad echoed, his eyebrows furrowing. She isn't here, sir. She called in sick. Sick? Richard found himself replaying the events of Saturday night, the way Marsha had held herself, the quiet dignity in her eyes. He'd thought it an act, a performance for his amusement, but now he wasn't so sure. He remembered the stunned silence that had fallen over the room as she sang, a silence so profound it had felt almost sacred. He'd felt it too, a strange tightening in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a feeling he now recognized as awe. He dismissed Chad with a curt nod, the silence returning as the door closed softly behind him. Sick, he muttered to himself, the word hanging in the air like a question. He swiveled his chair, gazing out at the city again, but his thoughts remained fixed on the woman who had cleaned his home for years, the woman he'd treated with such careless disregard. He realized, with a sudden clarity that bordered on panic, that he knew almost nothing about her. He knew the meticulous way she polished his furniture, the faint scent of lavender that clung to the air after she'd left, the quiet hum she sometimes made as she worked. But who was she? What were her dreams? He didn't even know if she had family, though he vaguely recalled her mentioning a son. He picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad. He wanted to call her, to apologize to what? He didn't know. He wanted to erase the image of her standing in his living room, the way she had looked at him, not with anger, but with a profound sadness that had pierced through his carefully constructed facade. He dropped the phone back onto the desk, the clatter echoing sharply in the quiet office. What could he possibly say? I'm sorry I humiliated you in front of my friends. I'm sorry I treated you like an object, a prop in my twisted game. The words felt hollow, inadequate. He rose abruptly, pacing the length of his office, the plush carpet muffling his footsteps. He felt a strange urge to escape, to leave the suffocating confines of his office, to breathe fresh air. As he reached the window, he saw her. Or rather, he saw her absence. The small, unassuming car she usually parked near the service entrance was gone. Its absence was a physical manifestation of the void he felt within himself, a void he hadn't even known existed until she filled it, however briefly, with her presence. You'll feel my absence now that you've finally noticed my presence. The words, spoken softly by Loretta Franklin on Saturday night, echoed in his mind. He had scoffed at them then, dismissed them as the ramblings of a sentimental old woman. But now they resonated with a chilling truth. He did feel her absence. He felt it in the unnatural quiet of his office, in a lingering scent of lavender that clung to the air, in the hollow ache in his chest. He felt it as a sharp rebuke, a silent condemnation of his own shallowness. He rubbed his temples, trying to dispel the growing sense of unease. He suddenly remembered the conversation he'd overheard between Loretta and Marsha, the mention of a birthday, of a cake Marsha's son had baked for her. He felt a pang of guilt, sharp and unexpected. He prided himself on remembering details, on knowing the right things to say to the right people. Yet he knew nothing about the woman who had been a silent fixture in his life for years. "I don't even know her birthday," he murmured, the words barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. He didn't just not know her birthday. He didn't know her. And in that moment, the vastness of his wealth, the power he wielded, the carefully constructed image he presented to the world, all seemed to crumble, leaving him exposed, vulnerable, and profoundly alone. The muted hum of the refrigerator was the only sound breaking the stillness of Marsha's small kitchen. Monday evening had settled over Tulsa, a quiet blanket draping over the city, but inside Marsha's duplex, a different kind of quiet reigned. The chipped porcelain sink, usually piled high with the remnants of dinner, was gleaming, the checkered linoleum floor spotless. Even the worn, floral print curtains seemed to hold their breath, as if respecting the solemnity of the moment. Marsha sat at the small kitchen table, the faded yellow tablecloth a familiar comfort beneath her hands. Her fingers traced absent patterns on the worn surface, each circle, each line echoing the swirl of thoughts in her mind. The weekend, still so vivid, played out behind her closed eyelids. The opulent ballroom, the shimmering chandeliers, the sea of faces turned towards her, it was a scene that belonged in a movie, not in Marsha Bell's life. She'd gone back to work this morning, the familiar routine a grounding force after the surreal experience of Richard Beaumont's party. Emptying ashtrays, polishing desks, vacuuming the silent, carpeted offices. Each task was a meditation, each movement a way to process the tumultuous emotions that still churned within her. The whispers and stares of her colleagues, a mix of curiosity and awe, were like phantom touches, reminders of the extraordinary turn her life had taken. But it wasn't the whispers that resonated with her now. It was something deeper, something that had begun to crystallize in the quiet hours of the night. Marsha lifted her hand, examining her calloused fingers in the dim kitchen light. These hands that had scrubbed floors and washed dishes, hands that had held her babies close and comforted her dying husband. These hands had, in some inexplicable way, shifted something. She'd gone to that party seeking a small measure of retribution, a way to reclaim the dignity Richard Beaumont had so carelessly attempted to steal. But as she stood there, amidst the glittering facade of wealth and privilege, she realized she had done something more. It wasn't about Richard, not entirely. It was about something larger than herself, something that transcended the petty cruelty of a rich man's joke. The image of Loretta Franklin's face flashed in her mind. The surprise, the recognition, the genuine warmth in her eyes, it was a validation Marsha hadn't realized she craved. Then the faces of the other guests, the slow dawning of understanding, the subtle shift in their demeanor, it was a silent acknowledgement of her presence, of her worth. It wasn't about revenge, she murmured, the words barely audible in the quiet kitchen. Her voice, usually soft and melodic, held a new steeliness. It was about reminding people who they overlook. The simple act of walking into that party, of holding her head high and refusing to be diminished, had become a statement. A statement not just for herself, but for every cleaning lady, every bus driver, every cashier, every person deemed invisible by society obsessed with status and appearances. The silence in the kitchen seemed to deepen, the weight of the realization settling on her shoulders. She hadn't just stood up to Richard Beaumont, she'd stood up for a whole segment of society, the unseen, the unheard, the perpetually overlooked. The memory of Dorian's encouraging words came to her, a warm current against the tide of her thoughts. Her son, her rock, had seen her strength when she herself hadn't fully grasped it. He'd reminded her of her worth, of her voice. And now, she knew she had used that voice, not in anger or bitterness, but in quiet, unwavering strength. A sigh escaped her lips, a mixture of weariness and a strange sense of peace. She had challenged the status quo, disrupted the carefully constructed hierarchy of that world, if only for a fleeting moment. The consequences of that disruption were still unfolding, the ripples of her actions spreading outwards, touching lives she might never even know. Rising from the table, Marsha moved towards the window, the faint glow of streetlights illuminating the small patch of yard outside. The world outside her window was the same as it had always been, yet something within her had shifted, something had irrevocably changed. The quiet strength she had always carried, the resilience forged in the crucible of hardship, had found a new expression, a new purpose. She looked out at the night, the city lights twinkling like scattered diamonds against the velvet sky. The weight on her shoulders hadn't disappeared, but it felt different now. Not a burden, but a mantle of responsibility. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But she knew now, with a certainty that resonated deep within her soul, that she was ready. Ready to face whatever came next. Ready to continue to remind the world of the inherent worth of every individual, regardless of their station in life. The fight for recognition, for respect, for simple human dignity was a long and arduous one. But Marsha Bell, the cleaning lady from Tulsa, had found her voice, and she wasn't about to let it be silenced. The silence in her kitchen was no longer a void, but a gathering of strength, a prelude to the battles yet to come. And in that silence, she found a new kind of power, the quiet power of a woman who knows her worth.